Morning, everybody. You might have noticed the garage has changed a little bit. We did complete our move. We got everything, for the most part, set up here at the new house. What we're going to do today is something that I hadn't actually planned on doing a video on because I didn't know we had a problem. I knew this vehicle was potentially going to need some air conditioning work at some point, at least recharge stuff, because of some stuff we'll get into later. But this one, the black one, when we actually went to go start it up a couple days before we moved it, I noticed the air conditioning system, or the compressor, was doing what's called short cycling. Fairly simple thing to diagnose, and it's probably just a charge issue, and we'll get into some of the reasons why these vehicles require recharges more frequently. But I just thought it would actually be a really good opportunity to go through a little bit of air conditioning diagnosis for people that are your normal or new into cars. They haven't done it for a long time. Kind of take away a little bit of the mystery to it. I know when I started messing with air conditioning, you go online, you start reading the forums, and everyone gives you this 9,000 step process, and it's got literally, you need NASA involved. It's way too complicated. You don't have to do absolutely everything that the people on the internet say. And again, a whole can of worms we can get into. But bottom line is we're going to go ahead and diagnose these two today and see if we can get the air conditioning on both of them working again. So with that being said, let me bring you over here. I've got a little diagram. I'll show you how this air conditioning system works. We'll get into how these two vehicles are both the same but very different. And depending on your application, if you're working on something else, you very likely will have to deal with one of these two style systems, and you can probably go ahead and diagnose it and charge it up yourself, or do what you need to at least get on the road. And it might last you years. You might have to do some more work later. So let me bring you over here and let's take a look. Okay, so the way one of these air conditioning systems, or the way an automotive air conditioning system works, is fairly simple. What you have is, obviously, you have your engine mounted somewhere in your vehicle, and you have mounted on it an air compressor, effectively. The only difference is that its job is to compress, instead of just air, it compresses what is called Freon. There have been a couple different kinds of Freon over the years. Early on, particularly when these two cars were built in the 80s, we were using what was called R12, which is still, I want to say, still found in a lot of industrial applications, like your refrigerators, large buildings, things like that. And there's a lot of talk as to why R12 was outlawed for automotive applications, as far as factory installation. There are some arguments that it had more to do with it being a carcinogen, and because it did have some carcinogenic properties, but a lot of it also was likely due to the fact that my understanding is that the people who came up with it, their patent was expiring, as they needed a reason to drown the baby and make sure no one could use it again and come up with a new Freon. So basically what they moved in the early 90s, or certainly by 2000s, but I believe by the early 90s, they moved over to what was called R134A, which has been the Freon until, 2016, 17, until very recently. And R134A is basically propane with a flame retardant in it. It works very similarly to R12, but it's not quite as efficient. It's been a while since I took a course on it, but I remember going and sitting in class, and it was something like 15 to 20% less efficient with the R134 versus the R12. There are stories of people having brand new vehicles in the 80s and the late 70s being able to turn the air conditioning down so low that they actually had ice collecting on their vents. I don't know exactly how true that is, but I can tell you that R134A has trouble keeping up with the numbers R12 supposedly used to be able to do.
But in any case, so back to the point, you have a compressor here, which compresses your Freon, which is in the system. You're going to charge it up. There's going to be a capacity for it. It's more than likely going to be something like, it'll be not volume, but weight. It'll be like 2 pounds of Freon for our application or something like that. And what you do is you charge it. It's all in here, but Freon will go through the compressor. It compresses it to 400-ish PSI, something like that. Again, we'll look at a gauge here in a little bit. The numbers are not as important. They are for very scientific diagnostic, and if you're really trying to get efficiency out of it, but for what we're trying to do, which is make old cars air conditioning work, it's not as big a deal. But it compresses, it goes through here, it goes into a component called the dryer. Dryer is just like a little, it's probably usually about the size of like a water bottle. But what its job is basically is just to catch contaminants that are in the system, whether that be moisture, whether that be little bits of debris. Also, there's oil in this system. You have to have a little bit for the compressor to run. It'll catch excess oil. And if it starts to run dry, it'll let that oil out into the system. But basically, its job here is just to catch any debris that could be bad for the system. Then it goes from, so it compresses, it goes through here, talking like 400 psi of pressure for this R134 Freon. It hits what's called either an expansion valve or an orifice tube. Now the way this works, and this is the reason there's two different styles for this. The older style typically is an orifice tube. That's usually what you saw in the 80s and 70s and before. Expansion valves are a little more modern, but basically they accomplish the same thing. What they do is they constrict the flow of this Freon, so that, like, it's kind of like if you hold a garden hose and you hold it down and the water suddenly accelerates. You let it go, it's just flowing at a normal rate, but if you close it, it seems like it accelerates. Well, what it's doing is it's creating a small restriction here. It opens it out, lets the Freon out of the system or into the rest of the system, but it's a small restriction. It either does it through an orifice tube, which is basically like a little threaded. I'll see if I can drop a picture in here. It's a little hard to describe, but expansion valve is just a little valve. It opens and closes. Well, it only opens a little bit and allows the Freon to go into the rest of the system. And when it does that, it suddenly the temperature drops. That pressure change goes from Freon being basically hot over here and super high pressure. The pressure drops, and then this becomes a low pressure side. And when it does, that temperature drops. And that's what allows your air conditioning to be cool, is it goes through here and it drops pressure, and then suddenly this is all cold Freon. Well, the cold Freon goes into what's called an evaporator core. The evaporator core is behind your dashboard. This is the part that if you pay a company to fix your air conditioning, they'll tell you they replace the whole system. I would almost promise you they do not change the evaporator core, because they have to pull your entire dashboard to do it typically. And they just don't. They just cross their fingers, charge you a ton of money. And what they're going to do is do that and then just hope that this comes back fine. But we'll, in any case, so the way that this works here is it comes in here, temperature drops, fan comes on, this is what's behind your dashboard. So as the Freon flows through this evaporator core, which is effectively a smaller radiator, this is going to blow air across it. And it blows air across this cold evaporator core through your vents and out to you. So that's how you get your actual cold air. As it passes through, it's going to go into another line, and the line's going to take it all the way back out. Now this is done for the purposes of making it more visible, and so you can understand it better. This stuff's laid out all kinds of different ways in different cars. But this is usually actually mounted. This is your condenser. Your condenser is mounted usually in front of your engine over here, mounted to your radiator, so it gets airflow as you drive along. But basically, it comes out here and it goes through the condenser, which is getting air blown across it by you driving, or the fan pulling it, the fan on the front of the engine. And that's supposed to drop the Freon temperature, because by this point it's going to be hot. It's gone through here. It's taken a long line. It's gone out under the hood again. It's gotten hot. This is supposed to drop at about 15 degrees. At this point, the Freon's probably around ambient air temperature, whatever that happens to be, 90 degrees, 100 degrees. This is supposed to drop at about 15 to 20 degrees before it makes its way back to the compressor. This is just to cool it down a little bit so it's not doing damage in here. And the whole process starts again. It goes in here, it compresses it, it forces it out through here, 400-ish PSI, hits that dryer. Any debris or anything will land in there. It hits the expansion valve. The expansion valve or orifice tube allows the pressure drop to occur. Freon suddenly gets very cold, goes into your evaporator core behind your dashboard that your fan is blowing over. The air gets cooled as it blows over that out to you. Freon will then make its way back out to your condenser where it's cooled a little bit and the whole process starts again. On this low side, we're typically looking for a pressure anywhere from around about 40 psi. So 300 to 400 psi, 40 psi on the low side. So that's where those are generally the ranges that we're going to want to see when we actually hook gauges to this thing, which we're going to get into. Now there's a couple different styles of compressor on these things. The compressor that's mounted on the 85 is going to be what's a on-off compressor. Basically, as pressure changes and everything, this compressor will switch on and switch off depending on what the pressure needs to be to operate. Okay, so if there's not enough Freon in the system and the pressure, it compresses up but then it loses pressure, it doesn't have enough, it'll switch off. If there's too much, and there's too much pressure in here, this is approaching 500 psi or something, it will switch itself off as its own safety feature. So what this means is while you're driving around, this compressor basically will kick on, run for a little while, kick off. Kick on, kick off. And sometimes under certain conditions, the particular humidity and temperature, it might run pretty much constant, especially at idle, but it comes on and off. And that's what's in currently the 85 GT, the Black Fiero, and what most vehicles have. This is probably the vast majority of stuff. What is in the white car and what is common amongst low power vehicles, again, remember that one's a 4-cylinder, is they tend to do it a couple different ways. Either they will clutch it, or so it'll have a clutch drive on the front that it'll still have a sensor and allow it to switch the clutch on and off under a different circumstance. But what this one has is actually something that's much less common. It has a variable stroke piston in it. So the way a compressor works typically is there's a bunch of different designs. It might be actual little pistons like in an engine. It might be they have these wonky discs that rotate. And what they do is that's what, as the Freon comes in, that's what pressurizes it, right? Well, what happens in here is it actually has the ability, this one uses one of those, a wonky disc on a screw that spins and generates pressure. What it does is it can back that screw off, or it can go compress it deeper, depending on the level of Freon. So the idea is that the AC clutch can stay engaged all the time, and the engine load can stay consistent. And this thing will stay cold or run the air conditioning, and it won't turn it off. Now, the downside to this system is that unlike the switched one that turns on and off on its own, you have to know exactly how much Freon is in it, and you have to charge it exactly by weight. You can't play with it, because we'll get into this in a minute, but with the on-off style compressors, you can take your gauges and your little can, and you can charge it and basically just get it on the low side. On the low side here, there's little check valves that you can check the pressure. You can just get it to like 44, 45 psi at idle, and you're pretty much good. You don't necessarily even have to know the volume that's in here. You just need to know what the pressure is on the low side, and as long as it's blowing cold with the correct range of pressure on the low side, you're pretty much fine. Problem with the variable stroke ones is that if you do that, you'll get it to that pressure at idle, and it'll sit there and run and it'll blow cold and everything. Problem is, unbeknownst to you, this thing has backed off that piston all the way, so it's running at the lowest compression possible, and it's doing it at idle. So when you go take off in this thing with the air conditioning on, it's got nowhere else to go. And so it's going to go from spinning at like 800 RPM to 1500, 2500, 3000 RPM. This is going to immediately overpressure and blow every seal out of the system because it can't turn itself off. And it can't back that piston off any farther. Again, the advantage of that system is that if it has the correct Freon level in it, it will run a consistent load on a low power engine, and you won't have it switching on and off where intermittently you'll lose about 10 to 15 horsepower. So it'll be smoother to drive, but it's much more problematic to diagnose and charge. So that's enough of looking at all of this. This is probably tired of staring at a piece of cardboard. Let's go look at cars right now real quick. We're going to check and diagnose at least the black car because we can diagnose that one by pressure. The other one, we just need to evacuate the system, get all the Freon out of it, and basically start from scratch. I know for a fact its air conditioning compressor is not coming on at all, and I know from dealing with it, it's just more than likely going to be a charge problem, again, from it sitting so long. So, all right, well, we'll go get started. All right, so there's a few different ways you can go about checking pressures and diagnosing this kind of stuff. I'm going to go through a few of these things here. So you can either have a full manifold gauge set. These things aren't that expensive and they tend to come in a kit. But if you don't have these things, this is much better. If you're going to have a number of these old cars and you're going to be diagnosing and trying to fix these things, you're going to want one of these. This is infinitely better for actually diagnosing and figuring out what's going on with things. And you can see the pressures. The gauges are very legible. They've got different ranges for different kinds of Freon, high and low sides. You've got switching valves. This will make your life a lot easier. You can also get away with a smaller gauge. You'll find these at parts stores everywhere. These only go to the low side, that's why it's blue. You would mount your Freon can on here and screw this down. It's reverse threaded, keep that in mind. It'll screw the other way to compress, but basically the little needle in there will punch the can, and what it'll do is it'll show you the range on the low side, and you can charge with that. Now we'll get into that here in a minute. What we'll be doing is we'll be using the big manifold gauges, but the same rules are going to apply. Basically what you're going to do is be attaching your Freon can, hooking this to the low side, starting the car, and then what you'll do once it's on here, these are both hooked up. You got a can on here, this is hooked to the car's running. You would twist this slowly to open Freon, and once you hear it start dumping, this is going to get cold. Remember that pressure change. And you'll watch this gauge, and this gauge will climb up into that 30 to 40 psi range, and your goal will be to keep it in here. And what you'll find is as the compressor kicks on initially, especially if it's very low, it'll drop down. That's fine. Keep feeding it. It'll drop down, it'll kick back on. Once it kicks off, it'll come back up, and then when it kicks on again, it'll drop down, but it won't drop down quite as far that time. And it'll keep doing this, and you'll probably have to open this up again once the can's empty, because it'll probably take more than one can. Back it off all the way. I would advise disconnecting this guy if you don't know if this actually seals. Disconnect this, put a new can on it, connect that back up again, then twist this in slowly again, and again, just try and keep that pressure until at idle. It's hovering in that 30 to 40 psi range, and you should start getting cold. And that will generally take care of most of your charging issues. And so you can do it that way. This is the way I did it for years. We're going to be doing basically the same thing with the big gauges. So that's, I just like being able to diagnose and see things better. We also have, although I don't know how much we'll be using it today because apparently it leaked some of its oil out of it sitting still for some reason. But in any case, this is a vacuum pump. This is what you use. So like you're going to generally, let we're gonna assume here you're starting with vehicles that have no Freon in them, because they've leaked out over the years, and you've done a repair or something like that. Of course, you should technically always have your vehicles have their Freon evacuated by a shop professionally and not put in the environment, because it's a bad thing for the environment and polar bears and penguins and all of that. If you were to allegedly just vent your Freon out into the world, and then because you need to start from scratch and then close it up, and then this is what you would use also. You would vacuum the system down. If you vacuum the system down, create a negative pressure situation in there, then when you do start hooking up, I'll go here to it. When you start hooking up your cans here and feeding them in through the low side, what's going to happen is not only does the can have pressure to feed it, but the system, since it has a vacuum, is going to be sucking that Freon in it, and then it's actually going to do a better job of more efficiently filling it. It'll also potentially pull out a little bit of the any moisture or anything that's in there. So with that being said, let's start here. We're just going to pull, this is our, remember, blue is low side. Pull the blue one out. Pull our high side off as well. Okay. And you're going to need to locate in your vehicle. They're all a little different. And this one actually has adapters, again, because it was an R12 vehicle. So these adapters are installed on it, which is honestly about as far as my conversion is from R134 or R12 to R134. Like I was talking about, people will give you a 6,000 step. You have to flush, you have to change this, you have to change that, you have to do all these things. That is technically true. And if you read all the ASC manuals and all of that stuff, you will find that, yeah, you need to do all this stuff because the Freons are not compatible. You can end up with blockages. But if you have one of these old cars that has not had Freon in it for a decade, there's nothing left in there. It's air, it's dust. You're going to be fine. You can charge with R134. The only thing is, if you have to add oil, just make sure you use ester oil instead of with the common stuff, which is called PAG. PAG is definitely non-compatible and could end up having a blockage. But if you have an R12 car, basically the conversion I would do before I spend a ton of money is basically just put these adapters on, so that you can actually charge it and see what it's doing, and then determine what you need to do after that. Because there's a fair chance with these old cars that that's all you need to do. So the way these work, make sure that this back is threaded all the way out. You just pull that collar forward, it slips on. It's on now. And then before you close this down or lock it down, make sure that your valves, because these are what are going, this is a manifold, right? It's when I press that down, that's going to compress the little Schrader valve in, which allows Freon out. It's going to come up this blue hose. If this valve's open, it's going to find a way out, and it's going to go out through here, through the yellow line, which is normally where our Freon comes in. So just make sure your valves are shut, but you can then press it. You hear it? So that means there's Freon in there, and we actually see something on the gauge now. So for R134A, we're currently sitting, engine off, we're sitting at about 70 PSI, it looks like. Don't get hung up on the pressures when the engine is off or it's just sitting here. That's not going to be indicative of much. Same deal for the high side. Get this hooked on. Got stuff in the way. Alright, so it's on. Then I can just tighten that down. Oh, it's not on all the way. Or it's that low. I've got like a vacuum hose in the way. It's making this less than fun. All right, well, we'll compress it down for now. I think that's on there. I'll take a look at it in a second. What we're gonna do, now that we've got these on, and we got readings here, what we're gonna do is I've got some cans. I still use the little 12-ounce cans you get at the store. Now, let me see here. got one handy. So it doesn't have to be this brand. It just has to be, if you're going to be doing this, get what's called, it would be some iteration of 134A. But what you're looking for is what is called R134A Freon. Make sure it says self-sealing can. Remember that. That's a different self-sealing valve for the can. Do not get anything that says stop leak or if it has any additive. If it has anything in this that it claims does anything in addition to just straight R134, put it back on the shelf. You'll pay more for it, and you're also going to just basically be putting goo in your system, in your air conditioning system. If you're going to be a candidate where just being able to just charge it straight up with these cans is going to work, you're going to ruin it by putting any kind of stop leak in it. I remember when I worked in shops and I talked to these guys, we always say it should be illegal to sell to normal people this stuff with the stop leak. But they sell it, and all it generally does is pretty much immediately ruin a system that's already on its last leg, and then the person has to spend whatever it is, $2,000 to get it fixed. So if you're going to get R134, this will be applicable for, it was factory equipped and pretty much everything from the 90s up to probably like 2017, 2018. Check your vehicle's application. And it will be reasonably compatible with anything prior to that. As long as, again, it hasn't had a bunch of other stuff. It doesn't have a bunch of old R12 in it somehow still. If it still has R12, leave it alone. So, but this will work. There's a lot of horror stories out there. People making things up about this. Just doing what we're going to do, just ruining systems. And it doesn't. Tell you it doesn't. So let me get this hooked up. Let me make sure, double check my lines are actually hooked up correctly, and we'll fire this thing up. We'll check our pressures and do what I think this one's just going to need to be topped off. I don't think we're going to need to vac it or anything. The way it was working, the way it was kicking on and off, we should be able to just top it off. It hadn't been topped off in a year or two. The reason they might need top-offs is R134 particles are slightly smaller than R12, and they tend to have the ability to leach out of the older lines. The problem, or the reason I've never done it, is air conditioning systems, in my experience, are inherently fragile anyway and end up needing to be repaired or replaced every few years, so you end up recharging them anyway. But the lines for the R12 stuff will seep just slightly the Freon out. Now again, though, a reasonably good sealing set can last 2, 3, 4 years before it will slowly seep. So neither of these vehicles have been, quote, properly converted. Both of them have functioning air conditioning that works the vast majority of the time in Texas. So, is what it is. All right, let me hook the lines up, check everything out, and we'll get to diagnosing this one and getting it going. All right. So, real quick, I just actually, while I was messing with getting ready to put these cans together, make sure, again, all your fittings are tight. Especially if you're using one of these manifold things, you hadn't used it in a while, it's been sitting on the shelf. Make sure these are tight, because I found that this one was actually leaking. So, make sure everything's closed up. We're good to go. Actually, let me get my other cans handy, because that's only half the can. It's probably gonna take a little more than that. By the way, here's another style of R134 you might find. They sell this at Walmart. If you're lucky, your Walmart will be heavily stocked with this stuff, just so people can charge up. It's not just cars. People charge their trailer home air conditioning systems too. So just top them off. Okay, so what we're gonna do, let me hook this up real quick. So I'm just gonna thread it onto here. This is an old can. This one, like I said, just had laying around. Okay, so it's on here. So now we have the system sealed. It's going to get a little louder, but let me go ahead and fire it up real quick, and then we're going to see what those gauges actually read with the air conditioning system on. sure why my high side's not reading, but what you can see here on the low, get in here. See how you hear the engine change. So when it drops, it bogs down, that's the compressor comes on. And pressure drops. It shouldn't be dropping, it should be staying consistent. It drops. Fan comes on. It drops below the threshold, so it's low on Freon, and the compressor turns itself off to protect itself. So that's what's doing is short cycling because there's not enough in here. So what we're going to do, let me set up here again real quick. What I'm going to do is start letting Freon into the system. Listen to the way the car runs. What you're going to hear is it's going to start to smooth out.
smoother now. It's not on and off. It'll probably kick off in a second. It's still getting enough in there, but
servicing one of these, you'd be doing effectively the same thing, charging on low side only. Note the pressure range in that green is what they give you on these little AutoZone gauges. 25 to about 45. As long as you're in that range, your system should be running effectively on the low side and should be cool. All right. And I'm going to take you down and we're going to show you what the temperature is blowing out of the vents. So right now, we are currently blowing just above 40 degrees out of the vents. Now it's a cool day today, but it's nowhere near 40. It's probably about 70. So we're about 30 degrees or more below ambient, which is plenty cool. The system is now running efficiently. It's not turning on and off. What we're gonna do is it could have a little more in it, but what we're gonna do is go and shut it down right now. If I need to put any more in it later, we will. We're going to move on to the white car because it's going to need to be charged a little more scientifically, and I can show you how to do that. Okay, so we're going to start on this one. Like I said, and we had discussed before, there are a couple different styles of air conditioning compressors. What you just saw with the black car was us charging up a on-off style compressor, which is vastly more common. That's what the majority of your vehicles are going to have. All V6 Fieros, in the event that this is the reason you're watching this video, are going to have that style compressor on it. Now, if you have, I'm not 100% certain on the early 4-cylinder cars, but if you have a late one, an 88 for certain, probably like an 87, maybe even 86, if you have one of these constant on compressors, you're going to need to charge them this way. So I've done a little looking around. I already checked the capacities on it. This thing is supposed to hold 40 ounces of R12. That's an important number. So when they charge these things, they charge them by weight of Freon, not volume. Okay, so it's going to be 40 ounces of R12 was the original Freon charge. However, R134, and this is an eccentricity of it, that's the newer stuff, is designed to operate at a lower pressure. That's another reason why it's less efficient than R12, is because the R12 stuff is supposed to, while it operates at a high pressure, it can, like we were talking about that pressure drop, that's where the cold comes from. It's at a higher pressure, has a more violent pressure drop when it comes across that orifice tube or that expansion valve, and that's where you get way colder air. R134, which, like I was telling you, is basically propane, is not quite as efficient and has to operate at a lower pressure to even work. So it was always kind of a kludge, just the automotive industry ended up going to it for, 20 some odd years. So, in any case, back to the point on this one. Those on-off style compressors you can charge by pressure, like we just did on that other car. On this one, we need to charge by weight. Now, the general rule of thumb is about 80% charge with R134 versus R12 because of that lower pressure. So, if it's 40 ounces, we're actually a little bit lucky here. Somewhere around that correct lower percentage charge is going to be around, so the cans are 12 ounces of weight. We can pretty safely put 3 cans in here, 12, 24, 36 ounces. It'll be less than the 40, and it should be enough to make this work. So that's a nice round, easy number if you're using 12-ounce cans from Walmart or HEB or what have you, and you can charge these things this way. Now, one of the things I'm going to do real quick is I'm going to hook this thing up to vacuum, because it's already had the Freon removed, but and I've confirmed that there's no Freon in this system. But I'm going to vac it down now, and the purpose of that is to give us a negative vacuum in there, so that when we hook a can to it, the cans do have pressure in them, and that will help them feed. And like I said, tipping them over, you saw me doing that earlier, that helps feed them as well. But if the system has a vacuum, it will actively suck the Freon into it, and you're less likely to have air or moisture in the system. Now, in order to do that, you have to have one of these, like I was showing you earlier, the vacuum pump. So let me go ahead and start hooking all of this up, and we'll get it vacuuming. Generally speaking, when you do this, you're going to want to vac it for probably a good 20 to 30 minutes, and then close your valves and shut it all down, and then go have lunch or something, come back in for 20, 30 minutes. The reason you do this, if you can, this is also to help diagnose for leaks. If you vac this thing down, it goes to a negative pressure, you close all your valves, it's holding pressure, you leave, you come back in 30 minutes, and it's come back up, it's now at ambient pressure, I forget the technical term for that, but basically there's no vacuum in there anymore, then that means you have a big enough leak that in about 30 minutes, you would probably leak out just about on Freon. You probably have a significant leak at that point. But what we're gonna do is I'll put it together and I'll check all that stuff, and we'll see where we're actually at. This car should be sealed up enough that it shouldn't be an issue. I know it does leak down, but we're talking again over the course of a year or two. And it's questionable whether an actual conversion of the lines to 134 would act, and O-rings throughout it would actually help that. I've seen plenty of vehicles that people spent, in fact, this is one of them, that someone spent a ton of money because they tracked down a new condenser, which is, remember, it's up front, those are unobtainium. They had the lines converted to R134, and they changed all the O-rings and went through this entire thing. The dryer was replaced. They did this entire car. They spent a lot of money, I know for a fact. And this one is the one that leaks Freon faster than the old one. So sometimes sleeping dogs lie, let the old stuff work, right? So food for thought. So let me start hooking it up and we'll get moving. Oh, and this one, I did convert it all. Actually, can I get a high side? I think I can get a high side on there. Yeah. Like I said, this one I know for a fact has been converted, quote, the proper way by a mechanic shop. A lot of money was spent, and it is a case study for as to why I do not trust or believe in the entire system needs to be thrown away and replaced with all modern stuff, and you gotta flush it, no, because this is one that's been done to. If anything, it has more air conditioning problems. But I'll stop ranting and we'll vac it down, and I'll show you what these gauges do if I can get them to stay in a good orientation for you. Let's see here. I'll bring you over to do that. All right, so you can't get noisy. And this is the same line that you would normally feed Freon with. It can be used to vac it down as well. And this doesn't have to be super tight, it's just a little wet from condensation. All right, let's put this on. Okay, so you probably hear it changing tone. These lines, see, it was wanting to come loose. Tighten that up. But you can see we're now just about at negative 30 inches of vacuum. That's what that right there is. Negative 30 inches of, forget what the HG is, but that's vacuum. What we want to see here is that it stays there. So we're gonna vac it, I'll let it vacuum for a few minutes, and then I'll turn it off, close the valves, and then I'll come back and check it, and I'll show you it's holding vacuum. And then we can move on to charging it. Okay, so it's been approximately, let me see here, it's been almost an hour, about 45 minutes that it's been holding vacuum. And you can see here on the low side, we're still right there pegged out pretty much at negative 30 inches of HG mercury. That's right. So we know that it's holding vacuum. We know that that it should be able to hold Freon, and that shouldn't be an issue anymore, that it would be leaking out or anything like that. So it should be safe to put Freon in there. So give me a second, we'll start putting cans in it. All right, first things first. We're going to go ahead and start the car. We've already got our gauges and everything hooked up. Make sure it's in neutral or
park if it's a standard. Open it up, fire it up. Make sure the air conditioning is on. See what the gauge says. Let's take a look. So we are now down to between, looks like about 50 degrees right now, which is pretty good. You let it sit here longer and probably get a little colder, but that's pretty good for a 1988. It's not quite as cold as the 85 right now, but that's pretty cold. It's cold enough to keep you cool. And you can see the gauges here. It's a great example. This one's actually reading correctly. I think there's a problem with the high side on my car with the actual valve. But you can see here, that is the beauty of this like clutched, or not clutched, but this variable stroke system when it is working. It's sitting here at idle right now and it's not changing load on the engine by switching on and off. We're holding just over 30 pounds on the low side, and on the high side, R134A, we're at idle, so we're only like 150 psi. I misspoke earlier. I was thinking of other stuff when the pressure would be higher. 400 psi is for other stuff. But in any case, the low side is typically what you're going to have to pay attention to anyway. So you can see the gauges there. So, all right, well, that works. All right, guys. Well, so that's a quick run through on both the Fieros and getting the air conditioning systems working. There's a lot more in-depth diagnosis that can go into a lot of this stuff. It just depends on kind of how problematic it is. The big thing though is understanding how the system works. If you understand how both systems work, then they're really not that scary. Like I said at the beginning, there's a lot of people who make a huge deal out of needing to flush and back flush and change a lot of components and this, that, and the other. That's great, and if you got time, you got money and all that stuff, you can do it, but it's going to be a big deal. The other thing is, I was using the big manifold gauges. You can do the same thing just on the low side with one of those little gauges from AutoZone, as long as it's got a gauge on it. It gives you that pressure range, that 25 to 45. As long as you're in there, you'll be okay. And honestly, if you have one of these old cars or you have an old vehicle and you just want to do basically a smoke test on the AC, make sure it functions, that the whatever computer controls it all kicks on like it's supposed to, the pressure switches work, all that stuff. That's what I would advise doing. You might find that it holds pressure just fine and you're good to go. You might find that you're gonna need to do more work. It just kind of depends. But like I said, this should work on pretty much anything up to about 2016. Anything that doesn't use, I think it's YZF 1234A or something, the brand new Freon. But and we can go into more stuff with these systems with regard to, like if you have a V6, there's a couple different numbers of compressor or model numbers. Some of them are harder to find now. I believe the two designations are HR6 and DA6. If at all possible, get the DA. The reason is because it has, I can't remember if it's, I think the inner liner is cast iron as opposed to aluminum, so they last a lot longer. That's just a thing for the 6 cylinders. If you've got one of these 4 cylinders with these variable stroke pistons in it, make sure you charge it by the correct pressure, whether you get it evac or it gets vented out just over time or whatever, but you need the correct weight in there because you're not going to be able to verify it. It's not like these older cars where you can actually just go ahead and top it off by pressure. But in any case, that'll work. And I promise you we'll see more of the Ram. We'll get back to that truck here in a little bit. I've got some stuff that we need to do. But for now, the Fieros, this is kind of something that just came up and I figured would make a good little how-to. And I know a lot of people ask me a lot of questions about air conditioning. I don't consider myself an expert in it by any stretch, but my old cars work and that's just how it is. So if you like watching any of this stuff, like, comment, subscribe, things like that. I hope it was helpful. Have a good day.